The forces of President Saddam Hussein in action in Kuwait City, capital of the tiny but rich neighbor Iraq had long yearned to conquer. The takeover, so clearly threatened, still caught civilians by surprise. Iraq's troops, though far outnumbering the Kuwaitis, didn't find things that easy. From a hotel room, an amateur cameraman filmed a Kuwaiti armored car fighting back. Smoke billows from the barracks of the elite Kuwaiti Royal Guard, the center of resistance, as they fought fiercely to protect the emir's palace. Kuwaitis fought bravely but were seriously outgunned. The arrival of Iraqi helicopter gunships signaled the inevitable climax. The appearance of the airborne forces aboard Soviet-made craft meant the end of the brief but bloody struggle by Kuwaitis to keep their independence, to deny Saddam Hussein his dream of domination. At least one of the helicopters had been brought down, the fate of its crew uncertain. Iraq didn't release any casualty figures for its own side, but it's now clear that for Kuwait, such a small country, the human price had been very high. As the clearing up began, it was reported that several hundred Kuwaitis had died. For the rest, and many foreign nationals, the future seemed extremely unclear, even dangerous. The world may condemn, but Saddam Hussein is not just a popular leader. He's a man fanatically revered by the vast majority of Iraq's 18 million people. And these crowds revere a man who believes he is the one person able to unite them with other nations in a huge pan-Arab state, a leader who portrays himself as the reincarnation of King Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled from Babylon in biblical times. As in so many totalitarian states, the leader's presence is felt and celebrated everywhere. His full name is Saddam Hussein al-Takriti, after the small town of Takrit where he comes from, where he first joined the youth wing of the ruling Ba'athist party. There are many stories of the young fanatic who literally fought his way up the party machine, personally murdering as he established his credentials for command in what's always been a violent society. For all his military uniforms and titles, Saddam Hussein has never served in Iraq's armed forces and never had military training. Yet it's the army as much as his secret police who keep him in power. An army regularly purged of any officers who step out of line. An army trusted no further than the political commissars attached to every unit. The army is huge, 1 million men under arms, 3/4 of them combat ready. Not only has it more soldiers than any other army in the Middle East, it's the 4th largest in the world and growing. It's well equipped with missiles. Iraq has 70 batteries of anti-aircraft rockets. When it comes to tanks, Iraq now has 5,000, dwarfing the armory of most of its neighbors, many supplied by the likes of America and Britain. Long-range missiles, the sort of menacing weapons fired off at Iranian cities in great numbers during the Gulf War, and Iraqi troops show every sign of being ready to cope with chemical warfare. A vast, frightening military machine, but for all its apparent power, Western analysts do not rate it very efficient. It did not fare very well in the war with Iran. Savage, costly, and largely futile. The Gulf War was a conflict which gained neither side much in the way of territory, but it cost them many thousands of dead. Soldiers in the empty wastelands where most of the battles were fought, and civilians who died when cities were attacked. Most sinister was the mass killing of Kurdish peasants when Saddam's forces used nerve gas in the mountain village of Halabja. Iraq stands at a strategic crossroads on the eastern flank of the Arab world. Almost all its neighbors are foes or potential foes, but it has one friend in Jordan, bound to Saddam's country by mutual trading needs. Oil dominates Iraq's trade, but her export pipelines and her oil fields have have always been vulnerable to attack. Another wide traveller was Saddam Hussein, whose steady rise had reached as far as Iraq's vice presidency. He met leaders like Mrs. Gandhi of India, another third world nation whose relations with the superpowers have fluctuated over the years.
There's a camera on the other side as well.
This period of Saddam's life proved he sounded out a wide range of opinion among non-aligned nations. By doing so, he was holding true to party philosophy. The Baathists have as one of their main objectives the pursuit of a non-aligned policy. The travels of Saddam to such nations took him to countries which, like the Iraq he now helped to run, were under totalitarian rule. He went to Spain when it was still under the fascist rule of General Franco. He met Tito in Yugoslavia. It was to be several years once Tito was dead before that country was convulsed by the social changes that have now swept almost every corner of Eastern Europe. There was one foreign leader Saddam should have felt reasonably at home with, Hafez al-Assad, the ruthless ruler of Syria. Iraq's Ba'athist Party actually began in Syria in 1943. The party's name means the Arab Renaissance movement, its slogan, "One Arab Nation, One Immortal Message." Saddam went there to negotiate a possible merger of the two countries. They seem to have many common interests: control by the same political party, encouragement of the growth of Arab nationalism, suspicion of the major powers who'd drawn the arbitrary boundaries of so many of the region's states, a passionate commitment to the destruction of the State of Israel. Despite all that, talk of union evaporated. And typical of the way that alliances shift and shatter in the Middle East, it was replaced by the deepest hostility as Iraq and Syria fell to vying for supremacy in the region. A classic round of Arab making and breaking of friendships followed. Jordan's King Hussein sought out the Syrians. Here now were two leaders sharing a suspicious view of the Iraqis. Assad had broken with them completely. King Hussein's position was and has remained more complex. His own early hopes for union with Iraq had been dashed when the monarchy there was pushed aside. On the other hand, much of Jordan's economy is dependent on close economic links with Saddam's Iraq. Hosni Mubarak of Egypt and King Hussein began to forge close links. Egypt has long been deeply suspicious of the expansionist tendencies of Iraq. After Saddam annexed Kuwait, it was Mubarak who cajoled other Arab states to put together a military force to try to deter further Iraqi adventures. Saddam, president of Iraq after 1979, had pursued his own priorities. He and Kuwait's leader were, at least publicly, on friendly terms in the early 80s. He held discussions at the same time with the Saudis, and indeed has continued to stress that whatever American fears, a takeover of Saudi Arabia has never been one of his priorities. But these are the people with whom Saddam has made no attempt whatever at dialogue, the Israelis, whose smaller but much more effective forces have time and again proved themselves against enemies without and within. Israel has fought a string of wars with its immediate Arab neighbors, invaded Lebanon to crush Palestinian activity, and has taken a tough line with Palestinian unrest in the occupied territories. In 1981, Israel struck decisively against Iraq. Warplanes set off hundreds of miles across mountains and deserts. Their target, a plant where Iraq was said to be developing nuclear weapons. The place was bombed to oblivion. Any nuclear weapon program was shattered. But it was Ayatollah Khomeini's Iran that set off the greatest and most immediate rivalry, a rivalry going back to the enmity of ancient times between Arabs and Persians. Like Iraq, the leader in Iran, the Ayatollah whose Islamic revolution had disposed of another monarchy, enjoyed mass support for a revolution aimed not only at transforming Iran's own society, but that of other nations in the region. In 1980, the hostility erupted into one of the most horrific wars of the 20th century. Saddam, less than a year after becoming president, launched a huge offensive against Iran. His strategy was a blitzkrieg intended to demoralize and scatter the Iranian forces, expected to be weak after the internal upheavals Iran had been through after the Shah's overthrow. Thousands upon thousands of Iraqi troops poured across the wastelands of the border area. The attempted blitzkrieg quickly bogged down, though, as Iran struck back with an aggression and commitment that surprised the Iraqis. As we've seen, Iraq's military forces are numerous, but numbers are little substitute for sound strategy and the shrewd deployment of modern weaponry. Iraq had entered the war with little apparent idea of how to end it. And it was a war with a lot more than mere territory or the ambitions of one determined leader to explain it. The possession of oil was right at the root of the conflict. Both sides concentrated on trying to cripple one another's oil installations and supply lines. This was economic warfare at its most destructive. The Shatt al-Arab waterway. Iraq had always claimed the oil-laden territory on the Iranian side was Arabian and rightfully theirs. Full possession of the waterway was the pretext for war chosen by Saddam. Just as Saddam had failed in his bid to assassinate General Qasem 20 years earlier, his Gulf War would prove to be another enterprise that failed for lack of planning. Whatever the bungling, superpower involvement was clear. Iraqi pilots flew Russian MiGs on their combat missions. The Soviets had little love for Saddam Hussein, but they were also fearful of Iran and its encouragement of Muslim fundamentalism. As the participants slogged out their wasteful war, the best the outside powers hoped for was the containment of Iran and possibly the exhaustion of Iraq.